The altar was supposed to be a promise of forever. Instead, it became the stage for the cruelest betrayal of Penelope's life. Standing before 300 elite guests, her fiancé didn't vow to love her. He grabbed a microphone to publicly dissect her body, her weight, and her worth. But as the church gasped in horror, a man in a bespoke suit stepped from the shadows. The city's most feared mafia boss wasn't about to let his obsession walk away broken. The stained glass windows of St. Patrick's Cathedral cast fractured prisms of ruby and sapphire light across the marble floor, illuminating what was supposed to be the most triumphant moment of Penelope Gallagher's life. She stood at the end of the aisle, a vision in a custom-made ivory silk gown. It had taken a team of seamstresses at the Vera Wang atelier in Manhattan 6 months to design the dress specifically tailored to flatter her size 22 frame. Penelope was a large woman, and for her entire 26 years of life, society had never let her forget it. She was fat, soft, and curvy in a world that demanded sharp angles and impossible thinness. But today, wrapped in cascading silk and French lace, holding a bouquet of white peonies, she finally felt beautiful. Waiting for her at the altar was Bradley Harrington. Bradley was the golden boy of the New York real estate elite, tall, impeccably groomed, with a smile that could disarm a hostile boardroom in seconds. When he had proposed to Penelope a year ago at the top of the Waldorf Astoria, she had wept. She had spent her life as the overlooked heiress, the sweet girl with a pretty face, who watched her slender, statuesque friends get swept off their feet. Bradley had told her he loved her mind, her warmth, and her generous heart. He had made her feel chosen. As Penelope's father, Arthur Gallagher, kissed her cheek and placed her hand in Bradley's, she felt a slight hesitation in her groom's grip. The cathedral was packed with over 300 of the city's most influential figures. Mayors, senators, and corporate titans sat in the oak pews, their eyes fixed on the couple. Father Thomas, a kindly older priest who had known Penelope since she was a child, smiled warmly at them. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceilings, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Bradley and Penelope." The ceremony proceeded flawlessly for the first 15 minutes. Penelope's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked up at Bradley, expecting to see tears of joy, or at least the comforting warmth he usually offered. Instead, his jaw was clenched tight. His eyes, usually a bright, engaging blue, were flat and cold as they swept over her body, lingering with a harshness that made the breath catch in her throat. "Bradley?" she whispered, barely audible over the choir softly humming in the background. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer her. Instead, when Father Thomas reached the traditional vows, the moment of no return, Bradley held up his hand. "Stop," Bradley said. His voice was sharp, cutting through the serene atmosphere of the cathedral like a blade. Father Thomas blinked, adjusting his glasses. "Excuse me, son." Bradley dropped Penelope's hand, as if she had suddenly caught fire. He turned away from the altar, his eyes scanning the sea of guests. He walked down the 3 marble steps, approaching the small podium where the choir director stood, and casually unclipped the microphone from its stand. A murmur of confusion rippled through the pews. Penelope stood frozen, the heavy silk of her dress suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. Her mother, Beatrice Gallagher, half rose from the front pew, her hand clutching her pearl necklace in panic. "I can't do this," Bradley announced into the microphone. The amplified sound boomed through the church, silencing the whispers instantly. He turned back to look at Penelope, a sneer twisting his handsome features into something ugly and cruel. "I tried," Bradley continued, pacing the altar. "I really did. I told myself that the Gallagher Trust Fund was worth it. I told myself that the board seat at Gallagher Industries would make up for the fact that I have to come home to this. He gestured toward Penelope with a flippant, disgusted wave of his hand. Penelope felt the blood drain from her face. The world tilted on its axis. No, her mind screamed. This is a nightmare. This isn't happening. Bradley, please. Arthur Gallagher croaked, stepping forward, his face flushed purple with outrage. What is the meaning of this? Stop this madness at once. Sit down, Arthur. Bradley snapped, his voice echoing with malicious glee. I'm doing you all a favor. I'm being honest. Look at her. He pointed a finger directly at Penelope, who was now trembling so violently that her bouquet shook, dropping white petals onto the marble. Do you honestly think a man like me wants a woman who takes up half the room? Bradley laughed, a cruel, echoing sound that made Penelope's stomach heave. I've spent the last year listening to her cry over diets, watching her try to squeeze into dresses that were never meant for a body like that. It's pathetic. She's a beached whale draped in expensive fabric. The only reason I put a ring on her pudgy finger was to secure the Harrington-Gallagher merger. But as I stood here today, looking at her sweating in that dress, I realized that no amount of money is worth waking up next to a fat pig. Gasps erupted throughout the cathedral. A woman in the third row let out a muffled sob. Beatrice Gallagher collapsed back into the pew, clutching her chest while the bridesmaids covered their mouths in horror. Penelope couldn't breathe. The humiliation was a physical weight, crushing her lungs, snapping her spine. Every insecurity, every cruel playground taunt, every whispered insult she had endured her entire life was being broadcast through a sound system to the most powerful people in the city. The flashing lights of smartphones flickered in the crowd. People were recording it. Her absolute degradation was becoming a digital spectacle. Tears spilled over her lashes, ruining her meticulously applied makeup, cutting hot tracks down her pale cheeks. She wanted the marble floor to open up and swallow her whole. She wanted to die right there in her Vera Wang gown. Bradley dropped the microphone. It hit the stone floor with a deafening screech of feedback. He adjusted his suit jacket, looking entirely unfazed by the destruction he had just wrought. The merger is dead, Arthur, and Penelope, go find a treadmill. He turned on his heel and began to march down the long center aisle, fully intending to leave her standing alone at the altar of her own ruin. Bradley didn't make it past the fifth row of pews. Before he could take another step, a sound echoed through the cavernous space that made the blood freeze in the veins of every person present. It was the heavy metallic clang of the cathedral's massive oak and iron double doors being slammed shut from the inside. The echoing boom silenced the murmurs and the weeping. Bradley stopped dead in his tracks, a frown marring his arrogant face. Standing in front of the locked doors were 6 men. They were not dressed in the mourning coats and tuxedos of the wedding guests. They wore sharply tailored, pitch-black suits, their postures rigid, their hands resting casually inside their jackets, hovering dangerously close to concealed weapons. But it was the man who stepped through the line of guards that commanded the room's absolute terror. Lorenzo Enzo Moretti. Even Penelope, drowning in her own humiliation, recognized him. Everyone in the upper echelons of New York did. Enzo Moretti was the phantom king of the city. Officially, he was a billionaire importer of Italian antiquities. Unofficially, he was the ruthless head of the Moretti Syndicate, a criminal empire that controlled everything from the docks of Brooklyn to the highest political offices in the state. He was a man of violence, of shadow, and of absolute power. He was 32, lethally handsome, with jet-black hair swept back and eyes the color of dark espresso. A faint silver scar cut through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a hostile takeover of a rival family 5 years prior. He wore a three-piece charcoal suit that screamed old money and new blood. He was absolutely not on the guest list. Enzo began to walk slowly down the center aisle. The rhythmic click-clack of his hand-stitched Italian leather shoes on the marble was the only sound in the dead, silent church. The elite guests, the politicians, the corporate raiders, they all shrank back in their pews, pulling their knees in, terrified to even make eye contact with the mob boss. Arthur Gallagher's face went from purple to a sickly, ashen grey. He gripped the wooden back of the front pew, his knuckles turning white. Arthur had a secret, a $50 million gambling debt that had quietly brought Gallagher Industries to the brink of bankruptcy, a debt owed entirely to the Moretti family. Bradley, completely oblivious to the gravity of the man approaching him, puffed out his chest. "Excuse me, who the hell are you?" "This is a private event. The show's over, pal. Open the doors." Enzo didn't even look at Bradley. His dark eyes bypassed the groom, entirely locking on to Penelope. The Mafia Boss looked at her tear-stained face, her trembling shoulders, and the way she was desperately trying to shrink into herself to hide her size. When Enzo's gaze swept over her full, curvy figure, there was no disgust. There was no pity. There was only a dark, burning possession that made Penelope's breath hitch. Enzo stopped inches from Bradley. He still didn't look at him. "Move," Enzo said softly. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone, laced with a thick, aristocratic Italian accent. It wasn't a request. Bradley scoffed, his bruised ego flaring. "Listen here, you greasy." The movement was so fast that Penelope barely registered it. Enzo's hand shot out his gloved fingers, wrapping around Bradley's throat like a steel vice. He didn't just grab him. He lifted the 6'2" groom off his feet. Bradley's eyes bulged, his hands frantically clawing at Enzo's wrist, his legs kicking wildly in the air. A collective shriek went up from the bridesmaids, but one look from the men guarding the doors silenced them instantly. Enzo pulled Bradley close, finally turning his terrifying gaze upon the man. "You speak of disgust, little boy." Enzo whispered, his voice echoing in the dead quiet of the cathedral. "You speak of physical flaws and aesthetic displeasure, yet you are the only piece of garbage polluting this sacred room." Enzo squeezed tighter. Bradley's face began to turn a mottled shade of blue spit, bubbling at the corners of his mouth. "She—" Enzo continued, gesturing to Penelope with a slight movement of his head, "is a masterpiece. She is a Renaissance painting brought to life. Flesh and softness, grace and fire. She is a queen. And you are a rat who thought he could steal from a dragon's hoard." With a flick of his wrist, Enzo threw Bradley to the floor. The groom crashed onto the hard marble, grasping his throat, gasping and hacking for air, tears of genuine pain and terror streaming down his face. Enzo stepped over Bradley's writhing body as if it were nothing more than a discarded piece of trash. He approached the steps of the altar. Penelope's father, Arthur, finally found his voice, though it was shaking violently. "Mr. M. Moretti, I didn't know you were coming." "The debt. I have the money, I just need another week." Enzo held up a single finger, silencing the older man. "I am not here for your money, Arthur. Your daughter's fiancé just loudly broadcasted to the city that the Gallagher-Harrington merger is dead. Therefore your company is dead. You cannot pay me." Arthur let out a whimpering sob. Enzo ignored him, ascending the final steps to the altar. He stopped right in front of Penelope. Up close, he was towering, smelling of bergamot, expensive tobacco, and undeniable danger. Penelope was paralyzed. Her heart was beating so hard she felt dizzy. Why was this man here? Why was he defending her? Enzo reached out. Penelope flinched, bracing for violence, for more mockery. But his touch was agonizingly gentle. His large, warm hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear that had clung to her jawline. "Look at me, Penelope," Enzo commanded softly. She opened her eyes, meeting his dark, intense gaze. "For 2 years I have watched you," Enzo said, his voice dropping to a register, meant only for her. "I watched you walk through Central Park. I watched you sit in the window of that little bakery in Greenwich Village, drinking your tea. I have watched you endure the company of a man who did not appreciate the ground you walked upon. I stayed away because I told myself the daughter of a legitimate businessman had no place in my dark world." He stepped closer, his chest brushing against the silk of her dress. "But today he broke you in front of the world. And I decided, to hell with the rules. I will not let a woman like you be discarded." Penelope's mind reeled. The feared Enzo Moretti, the monster parents used to scare unruly teenagers in the city, the man who allegedly ran the criminal underworld with an iron fist, was looking at her with a reverence she had never experienced in her life. Not from her parents, certainly not from Bradley, and never from herself. "What? What are you doing?" Penelope whispered, her voice raw. "I am offering you a choice, mia cara." Enzo said, his eyes burning with an intense, unyielding fire. "You can walk out of those doors alone. You can let tomorrow's headlines dictate your narrative. You can be Penelope Gallagher, the fat heiress, who was dumped at the altar, a victim of Bradley Harrington's cruel joke." He paused, letting the harsh reality of his words sink in. Penelope felt the sting of tears threatening to return. "Or," Enzo continued, his voice dropping an octave, slipping a velvet-clad box from his jacket pocket, "you can marry me. Right here. Right now." The silence in the cathedral was absolute. Not a single person dared to cough, to breathe too loudly. Father Thomas clutched his Bible to his chest, as if it could shield him from the Mafia Boss. "Marry you!" Penelope choked out, her wide eyes darting from his scarred face to the velvet box. I don't even know you." "You know I am powerful. You know I can protect you," Enzo countered, flipping the box open. Inside sat a ring that made Bradley's 3-carat diamond look like a cheap trinket. It was a massive, flawless emerald, surrounded by brilliant cut diamonds set in antique gold. It was a piece of history. "This is the Moretti family crest ring, worn by the matriarch of my bloodline for a century." He took her trembling gloved hand in his. His grip was firm, grounding her spiraling thoughts. "If you say yes, Penelope, everything changes." Enzo promised, his voice vibrating with a dark, thrilling intensity. "Your father's debt to my family, forgiven instantly. Gallagher Industries saved, and the man who humiliated you." Enzo cast a dark, sideways glance down at Bradley, who was currently trying to quietly crawl backward down the aisle away from Enzo's men. "I will systematically destroy his life. I will strip the Harringtons of their wealth, their properties, and their pride. He will beg for scraps on the street." Enzo looked back at Penelope, his eyes softening just for her. "Say yes. Be my wife. Be the queen of my empire. No one will ever disrespect you again. No one will ever dare comment on your body unless it is to worship it. Let me show you how a real man treats a goddess." Penelope looked at Enzo. She looked at his intense, handsome face. Then she looked past him down the aisle. She saw her high society friends whispering behind their hands. She saw her father practically vibrating with the hope that she would save his life and his company. And she saw Bradley, cowardly, pathetic Bradley, cowering on the floor, his arrogant facade completely shattered by the mere presence of real, undeniable power. For 26 years, Penelope had been soft. She had smiled through the fat jokes. She had laughed off the backhanded compliments. She had starved herself, hated herself, and allowed men like Bradley to dictate her worth because she believed she didn't deserve any better. But right now, standing in the ruins of her wedding, a strange, terrifying warmth blossomed in her chest. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was rage. Pure, unadulterated, vindictive rage. Bradley wanted to ruin her. She would ruin him. Penelope squared her shoulders. She stood up straighter, allowing the full presence of her size and the magnificent gown to take up space. She didn't shrink. "Will you destroy him?" Penelope asked, her voice shockingly steady. It carried through the cathedral, cold and clear. Bradley froze on the floor, looking up at her in horror. "Penny, no, you can't be serious. He's a criminal. He's a mobster." Enzo smiled. It was a chilling, beautiful sight. "I will wipe his legacy from the earth," Enzo swore. Penelope took a deep breath, the scent of lilies and Enzo's bergamot filling her lungs. She looked the Mafia Boss dead in the eye. "Then I do," she said. A collective gasp went up from the crowd, a wave of shock that rattled the stained glass. Enzo's smile widened, a flash of genuine, triumphant joy breaking through his hardened exterior. Without hesitation, he slid the heavy emerald ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He didn't bother asking how he knew her ring size. Penelope knew a man like Enzo made it his business to know everything about what he wanted. Enzo turned sharply to the trembling priest. "Proceed, Father." Father Thomas shook his head frantically. I cannot. We haven't done Precana. The marriage license is in Mr. Harrington's name. This is highly irregular." One of Enzo's men at the back of the church simply racked the slide of a shotgun. The mechanical clack-clack echoed with terrifying finality. Father Thomas swallowed hard, opening his Bible. "Dearly beloved." The ceremony took less than 5 minutes. Enzo did not use Bradley's script. When it was time for the vows, Enzo took both of Penelope's hands in his. "I, Lorenzo Moretti, take you Penelope Gallagher as my wife, my partner, and my equal." Enzo spoke, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "I vow to protect you with my life, to shed the blood of your enemies, and to honor you above all others until my final breath." Penelope's hands shook, but she held his gaze. "I, Penelope, take you, Lorenzo, to be my husband, by the power vested in me by the state of New York and the Holy Mother Church." Father Thomas rushed out, beads of sweat dripping from his forehead. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Enzo didn't just kiss her. He pulled her against his hard chest, wrapping his arms securely around her thick waist, and crashed his lips down onto hers. It wasn't the chaste, performative peck Bradley had always given her. It was a consuming, fiery brand of ownership and deep, burning desire. Penelope melted into the embrace, a surge of adrenaline and unexpected heat rushing through her veins. When Enzo pulled away, he kept one arm wrapped tightly around her waist, anchoring her to his side. He looked out at the terrified congregation. "The reception is cancelled," Enzo announced. He turned his attention back to Penelope. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Moretti." Penelope looked down at the massive emerald on her hand, then down at Bradley, who was staring at her with wide, terrified eyes, realizing exactly what he had unleashed. "Yes," Penelope said, a cool smile playing on her lips. "Take me home." Enzo escorted her down the aisle. The sea of wealthy, judgmental guests parted for them, like the Red Sea, averting their eyes, terrified to draw the attention of the new Don and his bride. As they passed, Bradley Enzo didn't even pause. One of his men stepped forward, roughly hauling the former groom to his feet by the back of his collar, preparing to drag him out the side door for a conversation. The heavy oak doors of St. Patrick's swung open, revealing a fleet of black armored SUVs idling on Fifth Avenue. Penelope stepped out into the bright New York sunshine, no longer the humiliated, rejected fat girl, but the reigning queen of the city's darkest empire. The armored Mercedes-Maybach Pullman glided seamlessly through the chaotic traffic of Fifth Avenue, acting as a rolling fortress, insulating Penelope from the ruins of her former life. Inside the cavernous cabin, the ambient lighting cast a warm golden glow over the plush cream leather. The soundproof glass completely muted the sirens and horns of Manhattan, leaving only the soft hum of the V12 engine and the rhythmic sound of Penelope's own shallow breathing. She sat rigidly against the door, the voluminous skirts of her ivory Vera Wang gown pressing against Enzo's impeccably tailored charcoal trousers. The adrenaline that had fueled her dramatic "I do" at the altar was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a cold, paralyzing dread. She had just married Lorenzo Moretti, the undisputed head of the Moretti Syndicate, a man the FBI had been trying to lock up for a decade. Enzo sat beside her, exuding a dangerous calm. He didn't crowd her, though. In the enclosed space, his presence was overwhelmingly magnetic. He reached toward a sleek mahogany console, opening it to reveal a crystal decanter. He poured a generous measure of amber liquid into a heavy tumbler. Macallan, 25. Enzo said, his deep, gravelly voice breaking the silence. He offered the glass to her. "Drink, it will settle your nerves." Penelope took it with trembling hands, the heavy diamond and emerald family crest ring catching the dim light. She took a sip, coughing slightly, as the expensive scotch burned a fiery trail down her throat, settling into a warm pool in her stomach. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "My estate in Alpine, New Jersey." Enzo replied, his dark eyes watching her carefully. "It is heavily guarded. No one from the press, your father's creditors, or the Harrington family will be able to get within a mile of the gates." Penelope looked down at her lap, her fingers tracing the intricate French lace of her bodice. The cruel echoes of Bradley's voice still rang in her ears. A beached whale, a fat pig. Tears, hot and unbidden, pricked her eyes again. "Why did you do it?" she asked, looking up at him, her vulnerability bleeding through her brave facade. "You could have just bought my father's debt. You could have taken the company. You didn't have to marry me." Bradley was right about one thing. I'm not a trophy wife. I'm not the kind of woman men like you parade around. Enzo's jaw tightened. The faint silver scar through his eyebrow pulled taut as a flash of lethal anger crossed his features, not at her, but for her. He took the crystal tumbler from her shaking hands, setting it aside before sliding across the leather seat to close the distance between them. "Do not ever repeat the words of a dead man," Enzo commanded, softly, his tone brokering no argument. "He's dead," Penelope gasped, her eyes widening in horror. "Figuratively for now," Enzo said smoothly, though the deadly glint in his eye suggested otherwise. He reached up his large, warm hands, gently framing her face, his thumbs smoothed over her tear-stained cheeks. "Listen to me, Penelope. I did not marry you on a whim, and I certainly did not marry you for your father's failing real estate portfolio." Enzo leaned in closer, his scent of expensive tobacco and bergamot wrapping around her senses. 14 months ago, the St. Jude's Community Center in Red Hook was facing foreclosure. It is a place that keeps kids off the streets, away from the gangs that even my syndicate refuses to touch. It is also the center my late mother built. Penelope blinked, surprised. The anonymous $2 million donation was traced back to a private trust in your name, Enzo finished for her. My men track every dime that moves through my territory. I wanted to see who saved my mother's legacy when the city turned its back. So I watched you. His hands slid down from her cheeks, his fingers gently tracing the elegant slope of her neck, down to her collarbone, resting lightly against her full cleavage, spilling over the tight corset of her dress. I watched you donate your time, your money and your heart to people who had nothing, Enzo murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. And I watched you shrink yourself to fit beside a man who was entirely unworthy of your shadow. You think you are not a trophy? You are right. Trophies are hollow, cheap metal meant to be put on a shelf. You are a queen, Penelope. You are brilliant, generous, and breathtakingly beautiful. But my size, she whispered, the deeply ingrained self-hatred hard to shake. I'm fat, Enzo. I always have been. And I thank God for it. Enzo breathed, his eyes darkening with a raw, undeniable hunger that sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. I want a woman I can hold, Penelope. A woman with softness and strength. Every curve on your body is a landscape I intend to worship. Bradley Harrington was a blind fool who wanted a stick figure because he lacked the strength to handle a real woman. I do not lack strength. To prove his point, Enzo's hand slid down to her waist, pulling her firmly against his solid chest. The kiss was not the sudden, shocking brand of the altar. It was slow, deep, and devastatingly tender. It tasted of expensive scotch and fierce protection. For the first time in her life, Penelope felt utterly and completely desired, not despite her body, but because of it. The Moretti estate in Alpine was less of a house and more of a modern fortress, masquerading as a sprawling architectural marvel. Nestled on 12 acres of dense private woodland near the Palisades, the mansion boasted bulletproof floor-to-ceiling windows, slate roofing, and a perimeter secured by men carrying tactical rifles. As the Maybach pulled into the circular driveway, Penelope peered out the window, intimidated by the sheer scale of wealth and power. Enzo stepped out first, offering his hand to help her navigate the heavy silk skirts of her dress. Waiting on the grand limestone steps was a stoic, broad-shouldered man with a closely cropped beard wearing a sharp navy suit. Penelope, this is Matteo, my underboss, and my most trusted friend. Enzo introduced them. Matteo offered a respectful, formal bow, his eyes entirely neutral, showing no surprise at his boss bringing home a bride in a wedding dress. Welcome to your new home, Mrs. Moretti. The staff has prepared the master suite for you. Thank you, Matteo, Penelope replied, trying to project a confidence she didn't quite feel. What is the status of the Harrington issue? Enzo asked, his hand resting possessively on the small of Penelope's back as they walked into the grand foyer, complete with imported Italian marble and a sweeping double staircase. Done, boss, Matteo said, pulling out an encrypted tablet. I made the calls while you were crossing the George Washington Bridge. The banks have frozen Richard and Bradley Harrington's assets, pending an anonymous tip about offshore tax evasion. The labor unions have pulled all construction crews from Harrington Real Estate's 3 active sites in Manhattan. By tomorrow morning, their stock will plummet by 60%. Penelope stopped in her tracks. You did all that in 45 minutes. Enzo smirked, a dark, dangerous curve of his lips. I told you, mia cara, I will wipe his legacy from the earth. He humiliated you. Now his family will learn what true humiliation feels like when they have to pawn their Rolexes to afford groceries. Matteo cleared his throat gently. There is one complication, Enzo. Richard Harrington is panicked. Word on the street is he realized you were behind the sudden financial freeze. He made a desperate call to the Calabrese family in Chicago. Enzo's eyes narrowed, the warmth instantly vanishing from his face, replaced by the cold, calculating mask of a mafia don. The Calabreses have no jurisdiction in New York? No, but Richard offered them a 30% stake in his remaining liquid assets if they take you out, Matteo warned. We intercepted a charter flight landing at Teterboro Airport an hour ago. 3 Calabrese hitters are in the city. They know you took the Gallagher girl. Increase perimeter security to level 4, Enzo ordered, his voice like cracking ice. No one enters or leaves the estate. I want those 3 hitters located and dealt with before midnight. Understood. Matteo nodded and briskly walked down the hall toward the security command center. Enzo turned back to Penelope, his expression softening instantly as he saw the fear creeping back into her eyes. Do not worry, he said, taking her hand and leading her up the grand staircase. You are in the safest place in the country. Let me take you upstairs. The master suite was massive, decorated in deep hues of navy charcoal and brushed gold. A fire crackled in a huge stone hearth, and beyond the glass doors a balcony overlooked the dark, sprawling forest. Penelope stood in the center of the room, suddenly hyper-aware of her situation. She was in a mafia boss's bedroom, wearing a 50-pound dress with hitmen hunting her new husband. She reached behind her back, struggling to grasp the intricate silk lacing of the corset. Her arms ached, and frustration bubbled up in her chest. Allow me, Enzo murmured, stepping behind her. He brushed her hands away gently. His long, deft fingers went to work on the silk ribbons. With every loosening of the lace, Penelope felt the physical and emotional constriction of the day falling away. She held her breath as the heavy gown pooled at her feet on the Persian rug, leaving her standing only in her lace bustier stockings and silk panties. She instinctively crossed her arms over her stomach, suddenly terrified. Bradley's cruel insults echoed loudly in her mind. Look at her. Fat pig. Enzo caught her wrists gently but firmly, pulling her arms away from her body. He stepped around to face her. Penelope squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the disappointment, waiting for reality to set in. Instead, she felt his lips press warmly against her collarbone. Then a kiss on the soft, fleshy curve of her shoulder. He dropped to his knees in front of her. Penelope gasped, opening her eyes to see the most feared man in New York kneeling at her feet. Enzo pressed a reverent kiss to her soft stomach, right over her belly button, sending a shockwave of heat straight to her core. Look at me, Penelope, Enzo demanded, looking up at her from his knees. She looked down, tears blurring her vision, but not from sadness. You are spectacular, Enzo whispered, his voice thick with raw emotion and heavy desire. You are a goddess of flesh and curve. Never hide yourself from me. Never feel shame in this room. He stood up effortlessly, lifting her into his strong arms, as if she weighed absolutely nothing. Penelope wrapped her arms around his thick neck, a choked sob of relief escaping her lips. He carried her toward the massive, king-sized bed, his eyes promising a night of devotion that would erase every cruel word ever spoken to her. But just as he laid her back against the silk sheets, the heavy oak doors of the master suite vibrated with a frantic, booming knock. Enzo! Matteo's voice shouted through the thick wood, tight with urgency. We have a breach. The Calabrese hitters didn't go to the city. They bypassed the outer gate. They are on the grounds. Suddenly the blaring shriek of the estate's security sirens shattered the intimate quiet of the night, echoing through the halls like a declaration of war. Enzo's head snapped toward the door, his eyes flashing from a passionate lover to a ruthless killer in a fraction of a second. He reached under the mattress, pulling out a sleek, matte black Glock 19, racking the slide with a terrifying, familiar clack. The honeymoon was over. The war had just begun. The deafening wail of the estate's security sirens sliced through the heavy romantic atmosphere of the master suite like a jagged blade. Enzo Moretti didn't flinch. The tender, worshipful lover who had been kneeling on the Persian rug a second ago vanished, replaced instantly by the ruthless apex predator of the New York underworld. He shoved the matte black Glock 19 into the waistband of his trousers and reached for a heavy, velvet-lined mahogany box sitting on the nightstand. Inside lay a suppressed Heckler & Koch MP7 submachine gun. He checked the magazine with lethal practiced efficiency. "Penelope, get into the closet," Enzo commanded, his voice devoid of panic but vibrating with absolute authority. He grabbed a thick silk robe from the foot of the bed and threw it to her. "Put this on. At the back of my wardrobe, behind the shoe rack, there is a steel panel. Press your hand against the biometric scanner. It will open a panic room lined with titanium. Do not come out until I or Matteo open that door. Do you understand?" Penelope's hands shook violently as she pulled the heavy silk robe over her lace bustier, tying the sash tightly around her waist. The adrenaline from the altar was back, but this time it was laced with pure, unadulterated terror. "Enzo, they're here to kill you. Because of me." Enzo crossed the room in 2 long strides, gripping her face in his large hands. He pressed a hard, bruising kiss to her forehead. "They are here to die," he corrected her, his dark eyes flashing with a terrifying promise of violence. "Go now!" Penelope ran into the massive walk-in closet, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpeting. Outside in the hallway, the unmistakable concussive pop, pop, pop of suppressed gunfire began to echo, followed by the heavy thud of boots and shouting in rapid Italian. She found the shoe rack and shoved it aside. The steel panel was cold under her palms. She pressed her hand flat against the scanner. A red light scanned her palm, but a mechanical voice chirped, "Access denied. Unrecognized biometric signature." Panic seized her throat. Enzo hadn't registered her handprint yet. They had been married for less than 2 hours. "Enzo!" she screamed, turning back toward the bedroom. Before she could reach the closet door, the main doors to the master suite were blown off their heavy iron hinges with a deafening crash. Splinters of ancient oak rained down across the room. Penelope slapped her hands over her ears, dropping to her knees behind a heavy velvet armchair inside the closet, peering through the cracked, louvered doors. Through the dust and smoke, she saw 2 men in tactical gear rush into the room, their weapons raised. But Enzo was already a ghost in his own home. He had positioned himself in the blind spot behind the shattered doorframe. He stepped out smoothly, the MP7 coughing twice. The 2 Calabrese hitmen dropped to the floor, dead, before they even registered they had been flanked. "Matteo, secure the east wing," Enzo roared into a tactical earpiece. "Boss, they didn't breach the perimeter fences." Matteo's voice crackled loudly over the comms. "They came up through the old Prohibition-era smuggling tunnels beneath the wine cellar. Someone gave them the architectural blueprints." Enzo's eyes narrowed. Only a handful of people knew about the historical layout of the property. The estate had been purchased through a blind trust handled by a specific commercial real estate firm. Before Enzo could piece it together, a third figure stumbled through the ruined doorway, dragging a bleeding leg. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing a ruined bespoke wedding tuxedo, his face streaked with dirt sweat and manic desperation. Bradley Harrington. He was holding a silver revolver, his hand trembling so violently the barrel shook like a leaf in a hurricane. "Where is she, you greasy bastard?" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking hysterically. Enzo slowly lowered his weapon, staring at the pathetic, ruined man standing over the bodies of the trained assassins. Enzo's lip curled in absolute disgust. "Bradley," Enzo said smoothly, his voice a low, terrifying purr. "I stripped you of your wealth, your company, and your reputation in 45 minutes. I did not think you were stupid enough to throw away your life on the very same day." "You ruined me!" Bradley shrieked, pointing the shaking revolver at Enzo's chest. "My father is facing federal indictment. The bank froze my accounts. I have nothing but the Calabrese family. They said if I showed them the tunnel, if I helped them put a bullet in your head, they'd give me back my life. They'd give me $10 million. You led assassins into my home for a paycheck. You will never live to spend," Enzo said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. Bradley panicked, his eyes darting wildly around the room. Through the cracked, louvered doors of the closet, he caught a glimpse of white silk. "Penny!" Bradley yelled, lunging toward the closet. "No!" Enzo roared, raising his weapon. But Bradley was already moving, crashing through the closet doors. Penelope scrambled backward, but Bradley grabbed a handful of her thick hair, yanking her up with a vicious jerk. Penelope screamed as he dragged her out into the center of the master suite, pressing the barrel of the revolver hard against her temple. Enzo froze instantly, his finger hovering over the trigger of his MP7. For the first time, genuine fear flared in the Mafia Boss's dark eyes. "Drop it!" Bradley screamed at Enzo, hiding his body behind Penelope's generous curves. "Drop the gun, Moretti, or I'll blow her brains out right here." Penelope was breathing heavily, the cold steel of the gun digging into her skin. She could smell the sour stench of Bradley's nervous sweat mixed with the copper tang of blood. "Look what you did to me, you fat bitch!" Bradley spat in her ear. "You were supposed to be my meal ticket. You were supposed to be the pathetic, grateful little pig who signed the checks. Instead, you marry this monster. Let her go, Harrington!" Enzo commanded, his voice eerily calm, though the muscles in his jaw were ticking violently. "If you pull that trigger, I will keep you alive for a month. I will peel the skin from your bones, inch by inch. Drop the gun and I will give you a painless death." "Shut up!" Bradley cried, pressing the gun harder against Penelope's head. Penelope looked at Enzo. She saw the sheer, unbridled terror in his eyes, a terror born not of losing his own life, but of losing hers. In that fraction of a second, Penelope realized something profound. Bradley wasn't strong. He was a coward, hiding behind the very body he had spent a year mocking. He was using her size as a shield. "I am a goddess of flesh and curve," Enzo's words echoed in her mind. "I do not lack strength." Penelope was a large woman, and right now that was her greatest weapon. Instead of shrinking away, Penelope leaned her weight backward, crushing Bradley against her back. She planted her feet firmly on the floor. With a sudden explosive burst of adrenaline and sheer physical force, she drove her elbow straight backward with all her might. The sharp point of her elbow connected with sickening force against Bradley's ribs. A loud crack echoed in the room. Bradley howled in agony, his grip slackening as the air was forcefully expelled from his lungs. Penelope didn't stop there. She spun around, bringing her heavy palm across his face in a brutal, ringing slap that sent him stumbling backward. The moment the space between them cleared, the room flashed with blinding light. Bang! Enzo didn't hesitate. He fired a single shot from his Glock. The bullet shattered Bradley's right kneecap. Bradley screamed, collapsing to the floor, dropping the revolver, and clutching his mangled leg in a pool of his own blood. Before Bradley could even take another breath, Enzo was across the room. He kicked the revolver away, grabbed Bradley by the throat, and slammed his head back against the hardwood floor. Enzo pressed the steaming barrel of the Glock directly between Bradley's eyes. "Wait." The word was spoken softly, but it commanded the room with absolute authority. Enzo stopped, his finger tightening on the trigger. He looked up at Penelope. She was standing tall amidst the wreckage of the bedroom. The silk robe was tied tightly around her curves, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with an icy, undeniable fury. She looked every inch the Mafia queen she had just been crowned. She walked slowly toward them, her bare feet stepping over the shattered glass and splintered wood. She looked down at Bradley, who was sobbing hysterically, begging for his life through mouthfuls of blood and spit. "Penny, please," Bradley choked out, staring up at the woman he had humiliated at the altar only hours ago. "Please, I'm sorry. I was desperate. Tell him not to kill me. Please, I'll do anything." Enzo looked up at his wife. "He came into our home. He threatened your life. The penalty for this in my world is death, Penelope. Give me the word, and he ceases to exist." Penelope stared at the pathetic creature bleeding on her floor. She thought about the diets, the tears, the constant feeling of inadequacy. She thought about the agonizing humiliation in St. Patrick's Cathedral. For a brief, dark second, she wanted to see Enzo pull the trigger. But then a cold, brilliant smile spread across her lips. "No," Penelope said, her voice dripping with lethal disdain. "Death is too easy. If you kill him, Enzo, his suffering ends today." Bradley let out a pathetic gasp of relief, thinking he had been spared, but the look in Penelope's eyes quickly drained the hope from his face. She crouched down slightly, looking Bradley dead in the eyes. "You told the entire city I was a beached whale," Penelope whispered, her voice devoid of any warmth. "You said I was pathetic. You said I was garbage. Well, Bradley, let's see how you fare in the garbage." She stood back up and looked at her husband. "Do not kill him, Enzo. I want him exiled. I want his face heavily scarred, so every time he looks in a mirror, he remembers today. I want his passport destroyed, his social security number erased, and every remaining dime his family has diverted to the St. Jude's Community Center. I want you to drop him in the poorest slum of a third-world country with nothing but the bloody clothes on his back. Let him live as a nameless, penniless beggar for the rest of his miserable life." Enzo stared at her, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his handsome, scarred face. The absolute ruthlessness of her judgment was magnificent. She was not just a survivor. She was a conqueror. "As you wish, mia regina," Enzo murmured, bowing his head slightly to her. He gestured to Matteo, who had just rushed into the room with 4 heavily armed guards. "The estate is secure, boss," Matteo reported, pausing to look at the bleeding groom on the floor. "Patch his knee," Enzo ordered coldly. "Give him the Chelsea smile, erase his identity, and put him on a cargo ship to the slums of Caracas. Ensure he is never allowed to die, but never allowed to thrive." Matteo nodded, a grim smile on his face. "With pleasure." The guards dragged a screaming, sobbing Bradley out of the master suite. His cries echoed down the hallway until they were finally silenced by the heavy slam of a door. Silence descended upon the ruined bedroom, save for the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Enzo stood up, holstering his weapon. He looked around the destroyed room, then back at Penelope. The fierce, icy queen melted away, and she suddenly swayed on her feet, the adrenaline finally crashing out of her system. Enzo caught her instantly, pulling her soft, trembling body against his solid chest. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling deeply. "You are magnificent," Enzo breathed against her skin, his heart pounding in time with hers. "I thought I was taking a wife to protect her. I did not realize I was bringing home a warrior." Penelope let out a wet laugh, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck. "I guess I just needed someone to remind me that I take up space for a reason." Enzo pulled back, framing her face in his hands. His dark eyes were burning with a fierce, possessive love that no bullet or assassin could ever destroy. "You take up exactly the space you are meant to, Penelope. In this house, in this city, and in my heart. He didn't care about the shattered doors or the bloodstains on the rug. He swept her up into his arms, carrying her away from the wreckage and toward the massive, untouched guest suite down the hall. 6 months later, the social circles of New York were still whispering. They whispered about how the Harrington family had mysteriously vanished overnight, their massive real estate empire liquidated and absorbed by a series of shell companies. But mostly, they whispered about Penelope Moretti. She sat at the head of the boardroom table at Gallagher Industries, wearing a stunning, custom-tailored crimson power suit that hugged every lush curve of her body. She had taken over her father's position as CEO, turning the failing company into a juggernaut with the quiet, terrifying backing of the Moretti syndicate. She was no longer the shrinking Violet trying to hide her size behind baggy clothes and nervous apologies. She commanded the room with an iron will and a brilliant mind. And standing in the corner of the boardroom, leaning casually against the glass wall with his arms crossed, was Enzo. The city's most dangerous man was entirely captivated by his wife. He watched her tear apart a rival corporation's merger proposal with surgical precision. When she caught his eye across the room, she offered him a wicked, knowing smile. Bradley Harrington had tried to break her by telling the world she was unlovable. Instead, he had handed her the keys to an empire and pushed her into the arms of a man who worshipped the very ground she walked on. She wasn't just claimed by the Mafia Boss, she ruled him. Penelope's story is a powerful reminder that the people who try to break you down often lack the strength to handle your true potential. Bradley thought he was discarding a burden, but he actually unleashed a queen. She found her worth not in shrinking to fit a toxic standard, but by stepping into her power with a man who celebrated every curve, every flaw, and every piece of her strength. Sometimes the darkest nights are the ones who treat you like true royalty. What would you have done to Bradley if you were in Penelope's shoes? Let me know in the comments below. If you loved this story of revenge, romance, and body positivity, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their worth, and subscribe for more intense dramatic stories.